I was at school and I'd been missing a lot of school playing truant, and I was in danger of being expelled. I was called in to see the headmaster, and he said, "Well, what's this all about?" And I told him a story about what things were going on at home and my dad's drinking and how that was affecting things. And so school became less important. And he sat and listened patiently. And at the end, he said, "Well, Burnham," he said, "I don't know if a single word of that is true, but you do tell a good story."
I suppose I can't remember a time in family therapy when John Burnham's presence or influence wasn't around. Mainly through the book he wrote, obviously, Introduction to Family Therapy. I'm thinking he must have been about 18 when he wrote that, because it's been around forever and he's not yet 100. So it's one of those influential books from early in my career that really made a difference to me.
This is the book, Family Therapy, and it came out in the early 80s and then reissued several times, and it's actually really well written. That's one of the abilities that John had, is making it relevant for the particular setting.
It's the classic text, which is timeless, and I think that's John. John enables you to be able to take on the ideas, and he teaches them so that you can then create them as your own as well.
His book was the first book I took and decided to go on a foundation course, and that's how I've known family therapy in Birmingham. And people I've travelled in America, they always talk about Birmingham, and the only thing they know about Birmingham is John Burnham.
In the systemic world, John is one of those figures where he's been on a bit of a pedestal, but actually there are a lot of other staff, nurses and stuff, and it used to kind of amuse me because they didn't live in that world. So John was just John, and I think there was something really sort of grounding about that.
He was doing a workshop and there was all this fuss and John Burnham is doing a workshop. No, I thought, oh my God, who is John Burnham? He's like a celebrity. So I effectively went to the workshop and was enchanted by John's presence.
Well, hello. It's a bit unnerving to be talked about like that before you come up to talk. You always feel you're going to have to be a disappointment in the context of an introduction like that. Well, Barry is anyway.
I clinically work in the National Health Service and young people's mental health inpatient unit, and I devote my time mainly to eating disorders. I've worked there since January 1977. It's a very moving kind of work and really rewarding to see how the community that is built up is such an important resource.
More people know Parkview for family therapy than they do for their inpatient units, and I think that's down to the dedication and commitment with John over the years. It's kind of something that's really integrated with all the other disciplines here at Parkview, unlike, I would say, any other NHS setting where there's often still ongoing battles to that recognition and for the modality and the profession to be recognised. Here there's that seamless integration, it's part of it.
The Parkview Clinic used to be known as the Charles Burns Clinic. John was a social worker at the time, and there was a risk of him being moved out of the clinic to another position. We felt that this would be a great loss. We worked hard to get a family therapist post. Eventually, of course, this came about, and John Burnham's appointment as a family therapist was the first one in the UK. There was a lot of opposition to working this way and exposing the trainees to this way of working, because there was a sort of set way of thinking about taking a proper history and seeing the child on their own. Working with families was sort of going against the grain of that way of thinking.
If you think about the course of our careers and how systemic we had to fight And the stories that we used to talk about was smuggling systemic into organisations, how to outwit your managers, that you were really doing what they said you should be doing, but you're really working systemically. And one of the things that we said at the time was that they can tell you what to do, but they can't tell you how to think.
I remember John, I saw him every so often when I was doing my foundation training, pop his head into the training and offer a few contributions here and there. And then Alison, I got to know when she did the intermediate teaching, where she did some of the research as well, and on the postgrad course. I remember quite a few moments from the intermediate where I really liked her style of teaching, and she brought a real difference to the training from a psychology background and also from a research background.
The training course came about because somebody approached John and said they were interested in his way of thinking and working because he'd gone off and done his training. And it grew from there over time, which Alison then came on board and contributed to and helped that to continue to grow further.
When I think about Alison, that's the bit that kind of rigour and the research and the beautiful way that she describes all of that stuff and makes it accessible for people like me who don't lean naturally towards that kind of thing. John talks a lot about complementarity, and I think that that exists between them when it comes to the training course. They have their separate roles and sort of come in and out as you need them.
It's more about how they both joined with different skills and how they complemented each other that has enabled it to be so successful.
I first met John and Alison in 1982 when I was in Calgary as a research associate working with Carl Tom. Carl was really curious about the coordinated management of meaning theory, and those Pearce and Cronin were the people I was studying with. So he put together a conference for the Milan guys, Luigi Boscolo and Gianfranco Achan, to meet with Pearce and Cronin. And at that conference, that's where I met John and Alison. Since then, they still hold on to CMM theory, the coordinated management of meaning theory, and integrate it into systemic practice and in such a beautiful way.
Barnett Pearce and I were questioning, what is communication all about? And working from a phrase by John Dewey, that communication is the primary social process. So all processes we call psychological or sociological or cultural. It's within the process of communication that all of those are made by people in interaction. What John added was so important, that notion of the graces. One of the critiques of CMM was that we don't confront very directly some of the big social issues. And what John was been doing with that the graces idea is to say, here's a rubric by which you can run through any part of CMM to enrich it and raise new and better questions about the actions and context.
John's probably quite famous for his acronyms and his quadrants, but I think his most famous one and probably influential one over the last perhaps 20 years, in conjunction with Alison Roper Hall, is the social graces, and that ever-growing acronym, which is it's so useful, but it's also quite funny how it keeps growing every year with another of those letters getting added.
The model I founded and then co-developed with Alison Roper Hall, called the social graces. It relates to gender, geography, race, religion, age, ability, accent, appearance, class, culture, ethnicity, employment, sexuality, sexual orientation, spirituality, ... S, which stands for something else. But it was a way that I used to try to remember all of the different aspects of identity.
Most people, when they think about John and Alison, they think about social graces. Often describe it as a kaleidoscope. It connects with intersectionalities, what comes to the fore or not. And both of them do teaching on clinical psychology doctorates to wider professions, not just the family therapy profession. And the excitement that you see for the first time when everybody hears about social graces and how attracted they are to these ideas and want to train further in them. So I'm thinking all these years down the line, it's such a key part and foundation of systemic thinking, right across from all the ideas that people are thinking around social justice. Systemic is also political. The political is also systemic.
The link between the social graces and issues of social justice are to not ignore our differences and not to oppress others because of our differences. I've often written about issues like you have an African American male who comes into therapy because the work context is oppressive, but that's not the way the therapist sees it. The therapist sees that this man is depressed rather than oppressed, right? So he may be experiencing oppression in the workplace, but in the therapy room, he's depressed. And then he's given medication, which numbs him even further to any form of social activism, to make a change.
You can make it as simple and stripped down as you like, but it's got to be done in relation to the people that you're talking with. So you're listening to someone and you're listening to their accent. Well, immediately you think about geography as a social grace. And how do you then use it to invite a conversation?
Social graces really help to complement my social work training and think about how do we open up space with a family where we're looking at culture and we're looking at gender and we're looking at disability and sexuality and how do we make that visible again as well rather than the invisible, and in a way that we can weave that into that conversation with the family and bringing ourselves into that, bringing our own social graces. How do we open up space where we're talking about our culture and our experiences that may be similar or differently, and what are the social graces we might shy away from?
When I started working in the field, there wasn't very much talk about social graces more widely in those kind of wider contexts. And so Alison and John introduced this concept of the social graces at a time, I think, when many of us were nervous about these kind of conversations, feeling awkward and what if I get it wrong, if I'm talking about race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality, what if I make mistakes? And it gave us confidence to feel, well, maybe it would be clumsy, but it was better to have those conversations than to remain silent.
In a way, I think he helped open up the idea that, a field in which many voices could be heard. I heard him talk, he talked about his background in where he came from, which again, he talked about a monoculture. I grew up in an area where very, very defined roles. And I kind of understand that, someone that visits the Northeast and where that comes from.
John grew up and was born in Newcastle. Lived around the Walker and the Heaton area of the city, which sits on the northern bank of the River Tyne, which at the time that John grew up would be a real industrial part of the city, dependent very much on shipbuilding and coal mining. When he used to come back to Newcastle, and he used to go to a social club where his father went to, and he said that when he went in, the guys of his dad's age who were around used to ask to look at his hands. He said they would all laugh at his hands because they were looking for calluses, sign of industry and hard work, or sort of discolouring of his hands. John said he retorted to them that sort of, well, my hands are nice and smooth and clean, but he said, you should see my backside.
A small similarity he and I share is northern white working class men who come from a particular kind of culture. And social class is one of the graces, one of the more neglected graces, I would say, but hugely important and hugely significant for me. You know, I have a lot of privilege structurally to do with my being a white man, etc. However, social class is one of the things where, you know, I grew up with disadvantage. So that's very powerful for me. And I think it is for John too, because many of our colleagues, trainees, students are also from working class backgrounds.
With John, he was somebody that was a great storyteller, and he also brought in a lot of his Northeast roots from Newcastle. And that was really grounding to hear a bit about his background. And he shared his cultural genogram, and he was really open about his life. I remember at the time I was somebody that was quite private in my personal life, but it really encouraged me to bring in my own personal stories and my own culture and some of the gender-based stories I had in my family, listening to some of his cultural stories. So I think it was a really good introduction as to how, if he could do it, you know, it encouraged me to do it.
As a trainer, I always think that I don't expect trainees to do something that I wouldn't be prepared to do myself. And I will give a personal example. I will take the lead by showing a willingness to share.
Like many people in the profession, he's been profoundly affected by George Floyd's murder and the whole kind of, what I think is a bit of an epistemological shift in systemic therapy.
Yeah.
And I know that he's put in an awful lot of work with global majority colleagues, and he's been very active in one of the AF groups. What I see is John bringing forth his colleagues, especially global majority colleagues, and taking a bit of a step back.
John has been so supportive of our group. He's been there for many meetings and has been encouraging, and he's shown great commitment to us. And I suppose what stands out for me about John is his kindness in reaching out to people, just checking in on them. And I think that's really fantastic to have.
I've been quite astounded in watching John, and I've been learning about this persistence and leaning in and just being really creative in the ideas that he comes up with, and he just keeps going. And I've really taken that on board, both in the DWP race group, for us to just keep going even when things felt difficult. And I've also started to adapt that in my professional life. And so I'm really grateful to that.
John's helped me to think about how I do my practice, how I do my supervision, and has made me more effective in both those, but also how he teaches is something that it's very creative and it's inclusive and non-judgmental.
One of the things I really enjoyed about John is he took up new ideas very, very quickly. The description of relational reflexivity captures it in a way where he tries to ground the work in the relationship between the therapist and the client or family, and is trying to look at what's going on in that communication process. I mean, I picked up the notion of reflexivity from CMM theory many years ago and used it to describe, you know, a category of questions, reflexive questions, which I found very useful. But John took it further and brought that notion of reflexivity right into the relational space, which is where I think it belongs. And that to me was a very creative contribution.
I don't think that I write anything or give any kind of talk where I don't mention relational reflexivity. I think that is such a critically important idea.
I think relational reflexivity to me is about really bringing in the other person and the party into that decision making and responsibility to how this goes on. So if I'm doing therapy with somebody, to be able to say, how's this going? You know, what do you need for this to be going in a way that is what you were looking for? So really bringing in that other person, be they a family, young person, somebody that you're training or supervising, checking that out and not just doing it once.
And so it's a way to sort of being more collaborative in the relationship with clients and co-constructing the process together.
Well, what goes with it is a whole set of really helpful questions about exploring the effects of your relationship, the effects of what you're saying, the effects of what you're asking on your family, on your clients, on your colleagues, which was not there before in systemic therapy. You know, being kind of steeped at one stage in my career in psychoanalytic ideas, it was like a kind of systemic way of thinking about the interaction between you and your clients, you and your service, you and your colleagues, which really took into account the way in which you were becoming together.
You know, I'm thinking about John's approach method technique, where he makes what to me is one of the most important points, that, you know, you can use just about any technique that you want. You can use something that might appear psychoanalytic or cognitive behavioral, but it's how you use it and how you're framing it within the approach that you take. At the highest level would be the philosophical approach that one takes. Are you, you know, an individualist, or are you more relational, systemic? Within that approach, there might be lots of methods that one could use. Things like the reflecting process and the ways in which we do consultations. And then there are a number of techniques. If we use a technique borrowed from another philosophical orientation, we're probably using it in a relational, systemic way.
I came to meet John in an article about approach method technique, which entirely puzzled me and exasperated me. But at the same time, I was struggling with theory and how it could be put into practice in my context in adult mental health services. And I continued to struggle. And then I met him in a workshop, and he was just not the person I thought had written that article. He sort of connected the theory to practice, but with a lot of fun and playfulness and humanity, making it feel as though something, these quite dense theories could actually be used in real work.
I remember when I was training to be a tutor, trainer, supervisor, and John was my tutor then, he'd say, you can use anything in the room to get a conversation going. It doesn't have to be special or so on, but what I found is that took courage. He didn't say it will take courage, but he said, you can use anything. And so I thought, okay, let me experiment with using anything, any situation, just going with whatever comes up.
When John came to Kent for an AFT training day, and there was an audience with an aisle down the middle, and John literally walked or danced his way down that hall, telling us in a sort of spellbinding way about the history and development of family therapy. I've never forgotten it, because it was like the dance of time as he walked down the hall. It was literally like imagination meeting rigor.
This is one of the most seminal books for me in training. Don't know if you've seen this one, Kate, in a long time. So Human Systems Journal, and it's a special issue, Voices from the Training Context, guest editor John Burnham. And this for me was so helpful, a bit like a systemic Bible, if there is such a word. I think it sums up how inspirational he is in his writing. And John always had a capacity to be able to help you think about your skills and abilities from different contexts and how you might integrate those into systemic thinking.
I was thinking about my Viva, so this was for my master's for Viva, and I decided I was going to sort of show show more about my creativity. I wanted to demonstrate and to expose more about myself. Okay. So I'm sitting there in the Viva, and suddenly I realized my top was starting to come undone. And I think it sort of threw me a little bit. And I think I said, oh gosh, my top's coming undone. And I think John, because we all know how quick he is, how witty he is in those moments, just said, well, Nikki, when you said you were going to reveal more about yourself, we didn't quite think that's what you were talking about. And this was in my Viva. Yeah, I think that just speaks to John's wit, and I think that's one of the many things I've really appreciated about John. He's quick, he's witty, and that kind of playfulness that you can have in the relationship with John.
I often credited with being very humorous, and I do workshops on humor, and I use humor a lot. And that's come from humor as a survival thing in childhood. In very difficult, conflictual, sometimes physically violent situations, or potentially physically violent, if you can say something funny, it often dissolves tension. But sitting with my middle daughter one evening, and she was saying something, and I made a humorous crack. And she looked at me very kindly, but very seriously, and said, Dad, you make a joke out of everything. I have a model called PPRR, problems and possibilities, resources and restraints. What I do there is to put something in the middle and ask, what problems might this give rise to? What problems might this resolve? What possibilities might this, whatever it is, open? Possibilities might it close down? So when I put humor in the middle, my daughter helped me to put, how and when is this a resource? How and when is a restraint? And that led me to move out of the story of myself as always humorous to sometimes thinking of a humorous response, but not saying it.
I know that John, he shows a lot of humility. He's very humble. Everybody that knows John, when they meet him, there's like, oh my gosh, you're so normal. And you make mistakes and you get things wrong and you're a bit clumsy. But what we don't know about John is how nervous he gets before presenting and speaking. I had the opportunity of, more recently, over the recent few years, presenting a few workshops with him. Right up, leading up to that workshop, we're rehearsing, we're practicing in detail. I thought I was doing an audition for EastEnders. I was like, we were working so hard. It was like, let's go through again. I say this and then you say this. Let's work through this again. And there was that real desire to wanting to get it right for everybody.
People create a story about themselves, and I'm not sure I have a story. Certainly I don't have the story. One of the ways I think about that is when students ask me something, and I'll say, well, why wouldn't you think that I would be worried about that as well? Or why wouldn't you think I would have difficulty? Or why wouldn't you think this about me? And they say, because you're John Burnham. And while I take that as some mark of appreciation and sometimes respect, I will often say, I don't think I know the John Burnham that you know. I don't see myself through the same lens.
Why does John not see himself through the lens that other people do, as John Burnham, the world-known family therapist and trainer and teacher? The lens that I see John through is he's been such an important figure around the country, around the world. He absolutely makes systemic ideas accessible to everybody. He's very, very generous. He is there for the people in the room, the families and the young people. And every student that we've had across the training programs, he's wanted to get the best out of them. I think John should be really proud of himself and his achievements and what he's done for the systemic world. As a northern man who came to Birmingham who brought the wider systemic world into a small clinic. He got the clinic known, he got himself known, he connected with people around the world, people respect him. I think he's really achieved a great deal in his career. He's just one of those people that you are privileged to have worked with.
John and Alison are so deserving in being recognized for all that they have brought to the field and beyond the field as well. I'm personally just so delighted that I know them both and feel very lucky that at this conference in 1982 we met and we've been able to stay connected for all these years.
John is almost like a Mona Lisa, a picture that reveals itself with time. You will never get to know him on whatever, how many years you spend with him. Then you meet all these people who come with different stories and you learn something new about him all the time.
It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you, John. We've laughed together, we've created materials together, we've been clumsy together, and you've unapologetically brought yourself, your vulnerabilities, and your humour.
Thank you for everything that you've done, and tell us more of where we're going to go next and that uncertainty of what to expect. There's something about looking forward to the future and reforming into something new.
Hello, John. Yes, it is me. So we met when we were approached to deliver some training together, and it's been such an honor to work alongside you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Alison.
Yay.
And enjoy your day, have fun, and celebrate in style.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
John and Alison.
Have a great time.